The horizon burned white under the noon sun, and the world seemed to crack beneath its weight. Caleb Vance sat on the porch of his ranch house, elbows on his knees, eyes fixed on nothing. The boards under him were splintered and gray like bones dried in the wind. Beyond the fence, the land lay flat and brittle, an ocean of dead grass broken only by the skeletal arms of a windmill turning slow, creaking like an old man's breath. His hat brim cast a shadow over eyes that had not softened in 2 years. If you're new here, subscribe to the channel and tap the bell icon. Stories like this deserve to be remembered. No one had spoken to Caleb in months. The cattle still moved through the fields, but thin and ragged, as if they too had forgotten what thriving felt like. The water troughs stayed half empty. The bunkhouse had collapsed on one side, and the barn's roof sagged like a bent back. He had stopped repairing things the winter his wife and son went into the ground, buried under a sky heavy with snow. Most days he carried his revolver out of habit, not need. It sat on the porch rail beside him now, sun-bleached and silent. He wasn't sure why he kept it, maybe just to prove he still existed. The air shimmered. Heat rose from the earth in trembling waves, blurring the horizon. Caleb squinted, watching the nothing, when movement stirred inside the mirage. At first he thought it was smoke. Then shapes grew inside the wavering heat. 4 riders, slow, steady, ghost-like. He rose to his feet without meaning to. The figures came closer until he could see they were women, young, dark-haired, wrapped in faded cloth that fluttered like torn flags behind them. The wind shifted, carrying the smell of horse sweat and dry sage. Dust clung to their faces. 4 Lakota sisters rode side by side out of the shimmering world, as if the prairie itself had decided to give them back. They did not speak. They simply drew their ponies to a stop in front of his porch, silent except for the soft leather creak of their saddles and the slow exhale of horses. Their eyes carried the hollow stillness of people who had ridden far from everything they once called home. Caleb's hand drifted toward the revolver. The lead rider dismounted. She was taller than the others, her face narrow, sharp with fatigue and defiance. Her braids were loose. Strands of black hair stuck to the sweat on her cheeks. She looked straight at him, unblinking. "Water," she said. Her voice was hoarse but steady. "We work," Caleb said nothing. The heat pressed around them like a blanket of iron. The second sister slid off her horse without looking at him, leading her mount to the trough. The third stayed mounted, watching him with wary eyes, her fingers curled tight around the reins. The youngest, no more than 17, slight as a reed, sat still as carved wood, her face unreadable. The lead sister stepped closer to the porch, boots sinking in the dust. "We work," she said again. "Food, water, just stay." "A while." Caleb's voice rasped like dry timber. "This is white land," her chin lifted. "Land doesn't care who dies on it." The words struck him like cold water. He had not heard that kind of fire in a voice for a long time. For a long moment, nothing moved. The windmill groaned. A buzzard wheeled above the fields. Caleb's mind flashed back. His wife's cough, the child's fevered cry, the stillness of their bodies after. The world had ended then, and yet here stood these 4 women, carved from grit and bone, asking him for life. Something cracked inside the stillness. Caleb drew in a breath that felt like the first in years. He nodded once, almost imperceptibly. "Water's in the trough," he muttered. "Barn's half standing. You can stay the night." The lead sister's eyes flickered. Not relief, not gratitude, but something quieter, like a candle refusing to go out. She gave a single nod and turned back to her sisters. They moved toward the barn, silent shadows cutting through the dust. Caleb stood on the porch long after they vanished into its darkness, the wind stirring the empty chair beside him where his wife once rocked. For the first time in 2 years, he did not feel completely alone. The next dawn bled pale gold over the prairie, the light catching on the broken glass panes of the ranch house like the last flickers of a forgotten fire. Caleb woke before the sun touched the ridge, as he always did, but the silence was different now. It wasn't hollow. It was taut, like a rope drawn tight between 2 hands. Outside, the sisters were already moving. They had chosen the old bunkhouse, a leaning structure of warped boards and rusted nails that had sat empty since the cattle hands drifted away 2 winters ago. Caleb stood on the porch, rubbing the grit from his eyes, watching them without moving closer. Winyan, the eldest, was pulling down the rotted planks from the bunkhouse windows. Her sleeves rolled to her elbows, the muscles in her arms taut and sinewed. Every motion was sharp, efficient. She did not look at Caleb once. Tali, quieter and slighter, was stacking split firewood with quiet rhythm, her dark braids swinging as she moved. Sina had spread a blanket out on the ground and was sewing up a saddlebag with thread so fine Caleb had to squint to see it. Peta, the youngest, all sharp eyes and restless hands, was pacing, surveying the ranch yard like a hawk, as though memorizing every fence post and shadow. Caleb's first thought was how out of place they seemed, bright threads of color against the faded canvas of his world. His second was how quickly they worked. By midday, the smell of smoke and cooking fat drifted from the bunkhouse chimney. Caleb hadn't smelled food cooking on this land in nearly 2 years. He lingered in the doorway of his kitchen, holding his coffee cup like a shield, listening to the sound of faint Lakota voices outside, low, melodic, carried on the breeze. They sang as they worked. Horses lifted their heads at the sound, ears twitching, calm. Even his own half-wild bay gelding stood still by the corral fence, eyes half-closed, breathing slow. It unsettled him. That night, Caleb lay awake on his narrow bed, staring at the rafters while the cicadas shrieked. He could hear laughter through the walls, soft, muffled, like water running far away. It stirred something brittle inside him. On the 4th day, Caleb found himself in the corral, sleeves rolled up, showing Sina how to knot a lariat. "Don't pull against it," he said, his voice coming out gruffer than he meant. "Let it slide. Feel the weight first." She tried, tongue caught between her teeth in concentration. The rope slipped, fell, raised a puff of dust. Peta laughed, a quick, sharp sound that cut the tension like a blade. Sina threw her a glare, but there was no real heat in it. Caleb caught himself almost smiling. He crushed it down. Winyan was mending fence rails a few yards off, her back straight, her eyes flicking toward him from time to time. Not watching, measuring. He felt it. He didn't know what to do with it. That evening, Winyan came to the porch while he was oiling his revolver. "You count us every morning," she said without preamble. Caleb glanced up. "I count my cattle too." Her eyes were dark, unreadable. "We are not cattle." "No," he said softly. "You're not." She stayed standing, arms folded. The wind moved strands of hair across her cheek. "Why did you let us stay?" she asked. Caleb stared at the revolver in his lap. Couldn't think of a good enough reason not to. For a moment, neither spoke. The cicadas roared in the grass. Then she turned and walked back toward the bunkhouse, leaving him staring at the dark. On the 7th day, he rode into town for salt, nails, and kerosene. He felt the eyes on him as soon as he dismounted at the general store. Pinewood Junction was small, 3 dusty streets, 1 church, 2 saloons, and it thrived on gossip like prairie fire. Men on the boardwalk nodded to him with the stiff courtesy reserved for someone they thought might be dangerous or broken. Maybe both. Caleb kept his answers short. He kept his eyes down. He thought about what would happen if anyone rode out to his place and saw 4 Lakota women working his land, cooking on his stove, humming their old songs under his sky. The cavalry still patrolled these plains. Not often, but enough. And white men, desperate, half-drunk, or cruel, rode through more often than that. The thought made his chest tight as he rode home. That night, the sisters lit a small fire by the barn. They were roasting corn in its husks, the air rich with its sweet smoke. Caleb stood a few yards off in the shadows, telling himself he was only making sure they didn't burn anything down. But he stayed. Sina was sketching something in the dirt with a stick. Tali braided dried flowers into Peta's hair while Peta tried not to smile. Winyan sat apart, back against the barn wall, her gaze on the dark hills beyond the ranch fence. Always watching. When Sina laughed, Caleb felt the sound inside his ribs. It was a strange thing, realizing the house had been cold not because of winter, but because it had been empty of voices. Later, lying in bed, he stared at the ceiling while the wind rattled the window. The sisters' fire had gone out. The yard was still. Caleb turned his head and saw in the moonlight the photograph on the table beside him. His wife, her smile thin and soft. Their boy, barely 5, frozen in the black and white forever. He closed his eyes. The silence did not crush him tonight. It held him, gently like a blanket he wasn't ready to admit he missed. He didn't trust them yet. He didn't trust himself either. but for the first time in 2 winters the house did not feel dead. The prairie lay quiet as if holding its breath, until the sound of hammers cracked the silence like gunfire. Nails bit into sun-bleached wood as Caleb drove them home, the muscles in his forearms taut beneath the fading light. A broken fence stretched before him like an old scar, jagged and neglected. Dust curled off every strike of his hammer, drifting into the hot gold of the evening air. A few yards away, the 4 Lakota sisters worked as if the land belonged to them. And maybe in some strange way it did. Sina hefted a post taller than herself, her braid whipping in the wind like a horse's tail. Little Petey winked at Caleb as she hauled buckets of water from the well, each one sloshing against her knees. The quietest of them, Sina, was crouched in the dirt, her finger carving patient arcs into the earth. And Winyan? She was bent over a saddle blanket, mending it with deliberate hands and an expression carved from stone. The evening sun burned low behind them, setting their hair aflame and catching the sweat along their cheekbones. Caleb caught himself staring too long and drove another nail to drown the thought. By twilight, the fence stood straight. The air smelled of cut sage and the sharp tang of iron nails. They sat by a crackling campfire. The sky stretched open above them, an ocean of stars with no shore. Caleb passed around tin mugs of coffee gone bitter from boiling too long. Pet wrinkled her nose but drank it anyway, trying not to cough. Sina smothered a laugh behind her hand. Sina hummed something soft, some tune that rose and fell like distant wind through pine. Winyan said nothing. She stared into the fire with the gaze of someone who had buried too many voices in her lifetime. The flames painted her face in bronze and shadow. When her eyes flicked up and caught Caleb watching her, neither of them looked away fast enough. Days turned to weeks. The ranch began to change. Morning light found them riding the range, their horses kicking up golden wakes through the knee-high grass. Caleb showed them how to swing a lariat, his rope whistling as it caught around a fence post. Pet's first throw landed on her own boot. She cursed in Lakota and tried again. Sina giggled from the saddle, her sketchbook bouncing against her thigh. Even Sina, the strongest of them, couldn't hide her grin when she finally roped a calf clean and true. In return, they taught him words, soft and strange on his tongue. Wichasha for man, Winyan for woman, Sina for blanket, Shunka for horse. They laughed at his clumsy attempts, yet there was something reverent in the way they said each word, as if language itself was a prayer. At night around the fire, Sina would draw Caleb's face in the dirt with the burnt end of a stick. She traced the lines of his jaw, the hollow beneath his cheekbones, the deep grooves beside his mouth. "You look like the hills," she said once in a whisper half lost to the crackle of the flames. "Strong, but lonely." Caleb said nothing, but the words rooted in him like seeds. Some days they worked in silence. The sun baked the land into hard clay and the air shimmered with heat. They dug a new well by hand, sweat stinging their eyes, blisters blooming on their palms. Caleb's shoulders burned raw under his shirt. Winyan's hands bled against the shovel. She did not stop. Once, when the wind caught her scarf and pulled it from her hair, Caleb saw a thin scar tracing from her temple into her hairline. He looked away before she noticed. That night she sat apart from the others, sharpening a knife by moonlight. Sparks danced at her feet. "You work like you're trying to outrun something," Caleb said quietly. Winyan's eyes lifted, slow and unreadable. "And you," she replied, "work like you've already been caught." Their words hung in the air like 2 gunfighters squaring off. Then she sheathed the blade and walked past him into the darkness. Rain came at last. A hard, drumming storm rolled in from the western hills, turning the yard to black muck. They drove the cattle into the barn, mud flying up their legs, lightning cracking open the sky. When it was done, they stood panting in the doorway, soaked and laughing. Winyan's braid had come undone, strands plastered to her cheeks. Caleb wanted to reach out, just to touch the wildness of it, the proof that she was real and not some apparition conjured by his loneliness. He didn't. He only looked at her and she looked back. Rain sliding from her lashes like tears she refused to shed. Something passed between them then, silent and trembling as a bowstring. Later that night, the storm gone, the prairie lay washed and new under the moon. The air smelled of wet earth and wild sage. They sat around the fire again, cloaked in blankets, shoulders brushing but not touching. Sina strummed a few halting chords on Caleb's old guitar. Peta sang a teasing verse about a coyote stealing a woman's shoe. Sina's head rested on her sister's shoulder, eyes half closed, her charcoal sketches scattered like fallen leaves around her feet. Winyan spoke at last. "My people once camped along this river," she said, her voice low and even. "My father was killed when soldiers burned the lodges. My mother died walking east in the snow." Her words cut through the night like a blade. No one moved. The fire popped. Caleb's jaw tightened. "I'm sorry," he said, and meant it. Winyan nodded as if she'd expected nothing more. "The land remembers," she said simply, and stared into the flames. Days grew longer. The prairie turned from gold to deep green. Life crept back into the ranch the way water finds cracks in stone. Caleb began to laugh again, soft and unsure, like someone learning to speak. The sisters' voices filled the canyon, their songs carrying on the wind like migrating birds. The air inside the house no longer smelled of dust and ghosts, but of coffee, smoke, and the faint sweetness of wild plum blossoms drying on the sill. And still, the tension grew. Sometimes he would feel her eyes on him across the corral, hot as the noonday sun. Sometimes her hand would brush his when they passed a rope or a tool, and the touch would linger just long enough to feel like an answer to an unspoken question. But neither spoke it aloud, neither dared. There was work to do, and work was safer than wanting. One evening, long after the others had gone to their bedrolls, Caleb stayed at the fence line, mending a loose rail under the stars. The wind sighed through the grass, carrying the smell of distant rain. Winyan approached without a sound. The moon silvered her hair, her face unreadable. She stopped a few feet away. "You've changed," she said. Caleb looked at her, at the fierce and haunted beauty of her standing in the starlight like some spirit carved from the land itself. "Or maybe I just woke up," he murmured. Her eyes held his, steady and unwavering. Then she turned and walked back toward the house, her shadow stretching long behind her. Caleb stood there long after she was gone. The night wrapped around him, the fence half mended, his heart pounding like hooves in the dark. The prairie was silent again, but now the silence was alive, trembling with everything unspoken between them. The first thunderclap rattled the window panes like musket fire, and the old house seemed to flinch. Rain lashed against the ranch house as if the prairie itself was trying to break in. Shadows jumped across the walls each time lightning tore the sky open, revealing faces drawn tight with something more than exhaustion. Caleb sat at the long oak table, his hands curled around a tin mug gone cold. The four sisters were gathered near the hearth where a meager fire hissed and spat from damp logs. The room smelled of wet leather and scorched coffee. Wind moaned through every seam of the house like a wounded animal. No one spoke. Even Peta's usual chatter had gone still. Winyan stood at the window, watching the storm like a sentinel carved from the dark. When she finally turned, her voice cut through the silence like a blade. "They will come," she said. Her sisters shifted, glancing at her but not daring to speak. Caleb raised his eyes slowly. "Who?" "The men," Winyan said. "The ones who killed our parents." The words landed like stones dropped in a still pond. Lightning flashed, bleaching their faces bone white for an instant. Sina shivered and drew her shawl closer. Tashina's jaw clenched hard enough to crack. "We were told you needed hands," Winyan continued, voice low and measured. "And we needed shelter. So we worked. But you should know why we came here with nothing but fear on our backs." Her eyes did not leave Caleb's. "Our parents were shot," she said, and her voice didn't waver though her hands tightened into fists. "Drunken cavalry scouts. They came through our camp one night laughing. They took what they wanted. Then they burned the lodges." A long pause. The fire popped, sending up a burst of sparks that hung in the air before fading. "We hid in the river reeds," Sina whispered. Her voice was the sound of torn paper. "We watched." Peta's eyes were wide and wet. She stared at the floor as if she could still see it. The smoke, the firelight on gun barrels. Tashina wrapped an arm around her shoulders and spoke for the first time, her tone like gravel. "After, they said we were wards of the government. Promised to send us east to a missionary school. They call it a school," Winyan said, "but they mean to cut out our language and everything we are." Caleb's breath caught. He had heard of such places, in faraway whispers from tired soldiers on long night watches. But he had never pictured faces to match the stories. "Faces like these. So we ran," Winyan finished simply, "into the hills, into the dust." And the men who killed our parents? Hunt us still, because if we live, the truth lives. The storm hammered the roof loud enough to drown a man's thoughts, but not Caleb's. He rose, slow and stiff like an old tree in wind. The shadows around his eyes deepened. I rode with the Union cavalry once, he said at last. Thought I was fighting to end something cruel, thought it meant something. The sisters looked up at him, 4 pairs of eyes like arrowheads, sharp and silent. I saw the war tier boys apart, Caleb went on. I saw fields turn to graves. But when it ended, no one told me the killing didn't. They just found new people to kill. His voice cracked on the last word. He looked down at his hands, the calluses and scars etched like a ledger. And I didn't stop them. Winyan's gaze blazed. You wore their colors. Yes, he said. His tone held no defense, only the flat weight of truth. And I carry it like lead in my chest every day. They stared across the table at one another, 2 battlefields in human shape. You stood by, Winyan said, her words slow and deliberate, while they slaughtered children. Caleb swallowed hard. And you think I don't know what it is to lose them? My boy, he died while I was still wearing that coat. Fever took him. I came home to a grave already cold. Something faltered in her face then. Not mercy, never that, but a flicker of recognition like 2 flames seeing each other through smoke. The wind howled through the cracks in the house. Rain banged on the roof like fists. For a long time there was nothing but the breathing of the fire and the slow, dragging silence between them. Finally, Caleb sank back into his chair, staring at the floorboards as if he could see through them into the earth. I've done nothing but bury things since the war, he said quietly. Friends, family, myself. Winyan crossed the room, not fast, not soft, just certain. She stood on the far side of the table from him, close enough that the firelight danced on her cheekbones, throwing her shadow long across the boards. And yet, she said, you are still here. No one else spoke. Sina stroked Petey's hair. Sina hugged her knees, her eyes wide and dry. Outside, the storm began to break. Thunder rolled off into the distance, leaving only the hiss of rain on the windows. The fire had burned low, glowing red and hollow like the hearts of everyone in the room. Caleb met Winyan's gaze. In it, he saw all the bones of this country, the graves, the grief, the stubborn flicker of life that refused to go out. She saw something just as broken in him. For the first time, they were not enemies. Not strangers, just 2 survivors adrift in the wreckage of a world that had forgotten them both. Neither spoke again. There was nothing left to say. They sat through the last of the storm in silence. 2 broken leaders watching the fire die down to embers while the prairie wept against the walls outside. When the storm passed, the air smelled of wet earth and ashes, and the silence in the room was no longer empty, only heavy, like soil waiting for something new to grow. The first orange light of dawn touched the prairie and glinted off 5 distant rifles riding hard through the dust. The wind came early that morning, dry and sharp, whispering through the brittle grass around Caleb's ranch. It carried the smell of something distant, iron, sweat, and gunpowder. He stood at the fence line with his rifle leaning on one shoulder, watching the specks on the horizon grow legs, then riders, then men. 5 of them. He didn't need a spyglass to know who they were. The way they moved, loose in the saddle like snakes with spurs. The same men the sisters had spoken of through trembling lips and clenched teeth. The same men who had left a riverbed full of ash and bones. Inside the corral, Winyan cinched the girth on her paint mare with hands that did not tremble. Tali tightened the straps on a saddlebag of cartridges. Sina checked the snares Caleb had shown her how to rig, while Peta silently tucked a knife into her boot. Their faces were stone now. Grief burned away had left something harder behind, something sharp-edged. Caleb turned from the fence and walked to them, boots grinding in the sand. They'll be here by sundown, he said. Winyan nodded once. Then we have until sundown to make sure they don't leave. They moved like ghosts through the ranch that day. Caleb hammered iron nails into the barn door until his shoulders ached. Tali stacked barrels of water by the bunkhouse wall to stop bullets. Sina strung tripwire between fence posts, marking them with feathers only they could read in moonlight. I'd carried buckets of pitch, splashing them across dry hay, turning it into fire traps. Winyan climbed the roof with Caleb, scanning the endless brown sea of prairie. Could ride away, he said quietly. We've run enough, she answered. If they live, they will find more like us. If they die, maybe the world forgets their names. Her words were flat, not cruel. Caleb felt something crack inside him. Not from fear, but from the weight of her resolve. She was barely 30 and had already lived through the ending of a world. He'd lived through the ending of his, too. Different wars. Same silence after. By dusk, the ranch was quiet as a held breath. They gathered in the barn, the last orange light painting their faces like dying coals. Caleb laid a map across a feed crate, his finger tracing the crooked cut of the canyons to the north. You draw them out here, he said. Long ride, hard ground. They'll stretch their line trying to chase you. I'll wait on the ridge. Like bait, Tali said softly. Winyan's eyes were flint. Like hunters, Caleb nodded. Then when the sun breaks the ridge, we break them. Night came cold and sharp. Stars shone like frozen nails across the sky. The sisters rode out before the moon climbed high, their silhouettes cutting through the grassland like black arrows. Caleb stayed behind. Alone now, he crouched on the ridge with his rifle across his knees, listening to the silence pulse. His heart hammered like hooves in his chest. For the first time in years, he wasn't afraid of dying, only of failing them. They came at dawn, just as the sisters had promised. 5 riders cresting the hill, silhouettes black against the newborn sun. Their coats were ragged blue Union issue, faded, stained, unbuttoned like the men who wore them. Deserters, killers, eyes hungry and empty. They followed the sisters' trail into the canyons, shouting, whooping, the crack of their pistols echoing off the stone. Dust rose behind them like smoke. From his perch, Caleb watched the dance begin. The first trap snapped with a sharp twang. Sina's snare yanked a rider clean from his saddle, the horse bolting as his scream ricocheted off the cliffs. Then came the second, Tali's tripwire slashing a horse's knees, sending man and beast tumbling into the rocks. The remaining 3 scattered, cursing, firing wild shots into the dust. Winyan rode between 2 boulders like a shadow, drew their fire, and vanished into the sunlight. Caleb steadied his breath. The barrel of his rifle found the 3rd man. He squeezed the trigger. The shot cracked like thunder. The man spun sideways, blood painting the sandstone wall, and crumpled without sound. The last 2 came for her. Winyan wheeled her mare and charged straight at them. Bullets tore the air around her, stitching lines through her hair and shawl. Caleb leapt from the ridge, boots slamming into the gravel as he ran to intercept. The world turned to fire and dust. Hooves drummed like war drums. Metal flashed like lightning. One of the riders swung his carbine like a club, struck Caleb across the shoulder. White pain exploded through him. He hit the dirt hard, breath gone, ears ringing. The man raised his pistol. Winyan's scream split the canyon. She threw herself from her saddle, slammed into the man, and they both went down in a tangle of limbs in fury. Caleb crawled up, blood in his mouth, and drove his boot into the man's skull. The crack echoed like a church bell. The man went still, only one left now. He was the largest of them, their leader, the one whose eyes burned cold even from 100 yards away. He fired at Caleb, the shot carving splinters from the rock inches from his head. Caleb ducked behind a boulder, chambered his last round, and whispered something. Maybe a prayer, maybe his son's name. Then he stood. The man charged. Caleb pulled the trigger. Both of them went down. Silence, sudden and total. Dust settled like falling ash. The sun bled over the canyon rim, turning the rocks to gold and the blood to black shadows. Winyan crawled to him, her hands slick with his blood. "Stay," she hissed, pressing her shawl to the wound in his side. "Do not leave." He smiled faintly, tasting iron. Wasn't planning to. Behind her, Tali knelt over Sina, who clutched an arrowed shoulder, teeth gritted but alive. Peta sat on the ground, staring at her bloody knife as if seeing it for the first time. The prairie was quiet again. The men who had once been monsters were only meat cooling in the sun. Winyan's face hovered close to his, her braid brushing his cheek. He could smell the smoke of her hair, the sweat, the salt of tears she did not let fall. "You stayed," she whispered. "I said I would." Her hand trembled against his skin, not from fear, from the unbearable weight of surviving. They rode back slow, wounded and silent, the bodies left for the carrion birds. The prairie wind rose to meet them, soft now, almost kind. The ranch came into view just as the sun climbed high, roofs scorched gold, fences casting long black shadows. It looked like a home again. It looked alive. and for the first time Caleb felt alive with it. The wind swept the last traces of battle into the horizon, leaving only hoofprints and the smell of gunpowder fading under the sun. The first wildflowers rose from the blackened soil as if they had been waiting for fire to pass. Morning light slanted through the skeletal cottonwoods around the ranch, painting the new leaves in pale gold. The air was softer now, carrying the smell of damp earth and thawing creek water. Snowmelt whispered down from the distant ridges where the battle's echoes had died, and the charred scars on the barn were patched over with fresh pine boards. Caleb leaned on the fence rail, his hat low against the sunrise. The silence was different now, no longer hollow but full, as though the land itself had exhaled at last. He watched the sisters at work across the yard, their movements steady and certain. Tali led the young colts from the corral with a calm hand, her shoulders still bound but healing. Winyan mended saddle straps by the doorway, her lips curled in the trace of a smile that had not existed weeks ago. And Winyan, she knelt in the flower bed beside the porch, turning the soil with her fingers. Her long braid caught the light like dark river water, and though her hands were rough from rebuilding, they moved with a tenderness that slowed Caleb's breath. For the first time in years, he did not feel like a ghost among the living. Inside the ranch house, laughter had begun to live in the walls again. It came in small bursts, shared glances over supper, teasing words as they worked, but it filled the hollow rooms more surely than any hammer or nail. They rebuilt not only the walls, but the rhythm of life. Smoke curling from the kitchen stove, leather drying on the line. Lakota songs hummed under breaths while mending clothes. Some nights, when the wind blew soft from the west, Caleb would find himself standing in the doorway just listening to life returning to what had nearly been buried, and sometimes Winyan would stand beside him. They rarely spoke in those moments. They didn't need to. Their hands would brush, almost by accident, and neither of them would pull away. The world beyond the ranch still carried the weight of its cruelty. Cavalry patrols sometimes cut distant lines across the prairie like dark stitches on pale cloth. Their banners flapped, their boots glinted, their rifles caught the sun. But the patrols never came close. Perhaps they feared ghosts in these hills, or perhaps the land itself had chosen its side. Caleb did not trust peace, but he had begun to believe in something gentler than fear. One dusk, Winyan joined him on the fence line, their shoulders touching lightly. The sky was wide and slow above them, the clouds glowing like ash embers. "My father planted wildflowers over my mother's grave," she said quietly. "Said roots can hold even sorrow in place." Caleb swallowed. His throat was tight as old leather. "I never planted anything," he murmured. "Just buried and left." She turned to him, her dark eyes soft yet unyielding. "Then plant," she said. The next morning they walked together to the hill where the last of his family lay. The sisters came too, each carrying small pouches of seeds gathered from the riverbanks. The graves were simple, wooden crosses weathered gray, their names fading. Caleb had not touched them since the day he carved them. He had feared that if he did, the ache would break him all over again. But as the sisters knelt in the cold grass, scattering seeds like blessings, something shifted in his chest. Winyan pressed a handful of earth into his palm. Her fingers lingered warm against the scars of his hand. "Let them rest," she whispered. "And let us grow," Caleb knelt. The wind picked up gently, lifting strands of her hair across his cheek as they laid the seeds together. Spring pressed on, quiet and steady. The barn filled with the sounds of new foals. Smoke curled from the chimney again. Wildflowers began to burst from the hill like fire caught in grass, brilliant and defiant. And every night when the prairie fell into its vast hush, Caleb sat on the porch steps with his rifle across his knees, not because he feared attack anymore, but because he had something worth guarding. Sometimes Winyan would join him, her shoulder brushing his as she watched the moon rise. They still did not name what had grown between them. Some things did not need names to be real. What mattered was that it was alive. The wind carried a Lakota lullaby from the sisters' room, the melody soft and bright against the dark. Caleb closed his eyes and let it thread through the silence, through the scars, through the hollow places he had carried for too long. The prairie lay vast and gold beneath the stars, and the ranch stood, no longer a graveyard, but a home. That was my story. If it reached you, tell me what you felt. Don't let silence bury us again. Drop your thoughts in the comments and tell me where in the world you're listening from.